Okay, so you sent us some pretty wild stuff
Yeah.
this time around.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about pornography.
Yeah, some intense stuff.
Some pretty heavy, potentially really sensitive stuff.
Mhm.
And we've got all kinds of angles here. We've got like articles, we've got videos,
Yeah.
looking at all these different sides of it.
Like the effects.
Yeah, like the effects, like where it come from,
Yeah.
how does it affect society?
Right.
And we even have some stuff about like criminal behavior and like, is there a link? So,
Yeah.
obviously our goal here is not to judge or,
Yeah.
you know,
Of course not.
take sides.
To just really understand.
Yeah, to look at the information.
The arguments that are being presented.
Yes, and like to understand it
Yeah.
for ourselves.
You're right.
So why don't we jump right into it?
Sounds good.
Why don't we start with this video
Okay.
about Wayne Cups?
Okay.
So this is the guy, right?
The former police officer.
Yeah, the former police officer who murdered Sarah Everard.
Tragic.
Yeah, absolutely tragic case.
Yeah.
And one of the first things that kind of jumped out at me watching this video was the alleged nickname his female colleagues at the Seoul Nuclear Constabulary had for him.
Oh, really? What was that?
The rapist.
Wow.
Apparently because of like, the discomfort that he caused them.
Right.
And this video kind of, it suggests this darker side to his personality.
Okay.
I'm talking about alleged drug abuse, predilection for like extreme and violent sexual pornography.
Interesting.
What are your initial thoughts on kind of like these details being brought up?
Well, I mean, I think what's really interesting to consider here is how this particular source is kind of attempting to, to build a profile.
Right.
Right. They're immediately drawing this parallel to Ted Bundy.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And highlighting, his own statements about how hardcore pornography, kind of influence his violent tendencies. And they're kind of suggesting this potential link between this type of content and real world, violent behavior.
They're saying that like, hey,
maybe this is like it makes you think about what is their argument against the normalization of hardcore pornography?
Right. Because they seem to be making a case that like, widespread exposure to this kind of material could have negative societal and relational consequences. Like, perhaps even contributing to an increase in violent sexual crime.
Right. And I think it's important to recognize that that is a perspective being put forward by this particular source.
Right.
And it's, while anecdotal evidence like Bundy's statements can be very compelling,
Sure.
it's also worth considering, the complexities of human behavior and all of the multitude of factors that could contribute to violent crimes. It's not necessarily a direct line from A to B.
Yeah, it's not like a proven thing. It's just like, hey, this is something.
This is something to think about.
Yeah, something to consider.
This is a potential area of concern that they're raising.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so then the video kind of goes on to talk about Couzens' significant debt.
Oh, okay.
At the time of Sarah Everard's murder.
Right.
So he was like 29,000 pounds in debt.
Wow. So quite a bit.
Yeah. And they kind of connect that, to the idea that like, major stressors in life can act as triggers for people to commit, violent acts. And they even say that, like serial killers often, operate during like pivotal moments of stress in their lives.
Interesting.
So they're kind of like floating the idea that, maybe this is something that was going on with him.
Yeah, makes sense.
What do you think about that, like that connection?
Well, I think it's definitely relevant when we think about the context of criminal behavior.
Right.
Stress is certainly a factor that researchers often, explore and look into. So I think it's like, they're kind of building this case, right?
Sure.
They're adding another piece to the puzzle of trying to understand, Couzens' state of mind leading up to this horrific act.
Absolutely. And I mean, financial pressure can be a huge stressor.
Oh, absolutely.
In anyone's life.
Of course.
And then they kind of go on to detail some of his online dating activity.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
So apparently he was, using false information on Match.com.
Really?
Yeah.
Like what kind of false information?
Like claiming to be unmarried.
Oh, wow.
And without children.
Okay.
And it also mentions, his contact with a female escort around that time.
So it seems like they're painting a picture of someone who is potentially living this kind of deceptive life.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And then finally, like this source even mentions reports from acquaintances about unusual behavior going all the way back to his 20s.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Including like dating a 14-year-old girl.
So this is raising questions about like potential earlier indicators.
Yeah, like red flag.
Yeah, red flags
Yeah.
of problematic behavior that maybe were missed.
Totally. And that kind of, retrospective information, even though it is anecdotal, it can be, significant when you're trying to understand someone.
Right, trying to piece together their history.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like it just adds like another layer to this whole narrative that they're building.
For sure. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So why don't we switch gears a little bit
Okay.
and talk about this video titled Porn Founded by Jews.
Okay.
So this source makes some very specific and potentially sensitive claims
Right.
about the origins of the adult entertainment industry.
Okay.
The main assertion is that Jewish individuals pretty much founded the industry,
Okay.
viewing it as like the seedier cousin of Hollywood, which they also claim was under like significant Jewish control.
Right.
What did you think when you saw this source?
Well, I think it's crucial to approach historical claims like these with a critical eye.
Of course.
And, the source introduces Reuben Sturman as kind of this key figure.
Right.
Identifying him as an Orthodox Jew and like the godfather of the modern day pip industry.
Right.
And saying that he owned like a huge number of bookstores nationwide.
Yeah, and this is in the video. The speaker actually
Mentions a personal connection.
Yeah.
This is their godfather.
Yeah, which I thought was really interesting.
And I think that personal anecdote is kind of being presented as, the supporting evidence.
It's like proof
Right.
for this broader claim.
Okay, so then they go on to argue that like Jewish individuals revolutionized and like made their own, the adult industry, here in the U.S.
Right.
And they even say that like, this control somehow negates any basis for anti-Semitism.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then they talk about how back in the 80s, like figures like Sturman allegedly held, considerable power in the industry, like even imposing a tax on other stores that were carrying his products.
Really? A tax?
Yeah. Like essentially, if you wanted to sell his stuff,
Wow.
you had to pay him a cut. So they're really painting this picture of like significant influence.
Total control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like a specific historical snapshot
Right.
focusing on the distribution side of the industry
Yeah.
in a particular era.
Right.
And, the claim about this tax system inaccurate
Right.
would indicate that he did have a significant market position.
Yeah, for sure.
And, the source also notes his later imprisonment for
Yeah.
tax evasion.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, contrasting it with like earlier obscenity charges,
Right.
which kind of gives you some context
Yeah, for sure.
to the legal history of the industry at the time.
Okay. I thought it was really specific when they break down the demographics of performers in the 70s.
Okay.
Supposedly, a majority of male performers were Jewish, while the majority of female performers were Roman Catholic.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then it just goes on to say that, like, business owners in the industry were pretty much Jewish or have Jewish ties or had worked for Jewish individuals.
Right.
So, like, how do we evaluate claims like these?
Well, I think anytime you're talking about, ethnic or religious backgrounds of individuals in any industry,
Right.
it requires careful scrutiny.
Yeah.
And, ideally corroboration from diverse historical sources.
Yeah.
So, again, you have to remember this video is presenting a specific narrative.
Right.
And establishing the accuracy and broader context of these demographic claims
Right.
would require looking at a range of independent historical research
Of course. Yeah.
and perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely.
These things are complicated.
Of course. History is messy.
Yes, agreed. Okay, let's move on to our final piece of source material.
Okay.
This video that asserts that porn is an addiction.
Okay.
So this takes a completely different approach.
Yeah.
Looking at, the potential for pornography to be addictive
Uh-huh.
and its wider societal consequences.
Okay.
It explains, how dopamine is released during sexual excitement.
And argues that pornography basically hijacks the dopamine system.
That's interesting.
Can you kind of like break that down a little bit?
Sure. So what I find particularly fascinating here is how they distinguish between the anticipation of pleasure
Right.
and the actual, satisfaction of pleasure.
Like the act itself.
Right, exactly. And they argue that pornography disproportionately stimulates the brain's reward pathways that are associated with the anticipation.
Uh-huh.
So what they call the appetitive system,
Right.
without necessarily leading to the same level of fulfillment.
Right.
That comes from real life sexual interaction.
Okay.
And it's that, hyperactivation of the appetitive system
right.
that's really central to their argument of
Yeah.
its addictive potential.
Got it. Okay. So then they go on to like talk about, the neurological basis of addiction.
Right.
Like explaining that principle.
Neurons that fire together, wire together.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And suggesting that, repeated exposure and focused attention and the dopamine release during, pornography consumption can lead to actual changes in brain circuitry.
Right, like it's physically rewiring your brain.
Yeah, exactly. And they also talk about the concept of tolerance.
Right.
Where users may need more and harder P to achieve the same effect.
Which mirrors the pattern seen in,
It's substance abuse.
in substance addictions.
Yeah.
Here.
And that obviously, raises concerns.
Of course.
About, the impacts on someone's, real world desires and behaviors.
Right. If you need more and more
to
get that same feeling,
Right.
what does that mean
Totally
to live
is.
your life?
And then they kind of broaden their scope to societal impact,
Okay.
arguing that as pornography potentially rewires, individual brains, it also rewires society.
Wow. Okay.
And then they introduced the views of this guy, Roger Scruton,
Okay.
who considered pornography a great social disease and attributed its legalization to the culture of the liberal elite and legal activism that went against majority values.
Interesting.
So what do you think about bringing in this kind of socio-political commentary?
Well, I mean, I think Scruton's perspective offers a very distinct, philosophical and cultural critique.
Right.
He's really, linking the increased acceptance and legality of pornography to broader shifts in, societal values and the influence of, particular intellectual and political movements.
Right.
So it's a viewpoint that sees this shift as detrimental to, social well-being.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And then finally, they connect these ideas to the ideological roots in the Frankfurt School.
Okay.
And Herbert Marcuse's concept of a liberated society centered on pleasure.
Interesting.
Which, suggests this kind of historical and philosophical context for certain perspectives on pornography in contemporary society. So for someone who's unfamiliar, could you kind of briefly explain the relevance of the Frankfurt School and Marcuse?
Sure. So in a nutshell, the Frankfurt School was this group of thinkers who developed critical theory.
Okay.
And they often focused on, how power structures and ideologies shape society.
Right.
Herbert Marcuse was one of the key figures associated with this school.
Okay.
And he did write about this idea of liberation, including the role of pleasure.
Okay.
And I think the source is kind of suggesting that, certain interpretations of their ideas might have contributed to this cultural shift.
Right. Yeah.
That's more accepting of pornography as a form of liberation or personal freedom.
That's interesting.
Centered on pleasure.
Yeah. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, we've kind of navigated some pretty complex terrain.
Definitely.
Based on these materials that you shared.
Yeah, we've gone, from the individual to the societal.
Absolutely. We've gone all over the place.
Yeah.
We explored, the information presented about Wayne Couzens.
Yeah.
Including, those alleged behavioral issues.
Right.
And that proposed link between extreme pornography and violent tendencies. We examined those claims about the historical origins and alleged significant influence of Jewish individuals in the pornography industry. And then finally, we really delved into the argument that pornography can be addictive, outlining those neurological perspectives and the source's views on its potential negative societal consequences.
Bringing in those big thinkers.
Yes, exactly like Roger Scruton. And the Frankfurt School.
It's a lot to digest.
Yeah, it is.
For sure.
And I think it's important to reiterate that, our aim here has been to understand and convey the information and the arguments.
As they were presented.
As they were presented in your sources.
Yeah.
We have not aimed to validate or refute any of these viewpoints ourselves, but rather to provide you with a clear overview of the content.
Great. We're just trying to understand what these sources are saying.
Exactly. And that brings us to a final thought for you to consider.
Okay.
Looking back at all of these different angles, we have the individual behavioral issues. The claims about the historical roots and control of the industry.
Right.
And then the arguments about the addictive potential and societal impact. What new questions or connections are forming for you about the role and influence of pornography?
Yeah, it's definitely a multifaceted topic
Huge.
with a lot to think about.
Absolutely a lot to think about.
Yeah.
So thank you for sending us this material
Of course.
and for taking this deep dive with us.
My pleasure.
Yeah, it was a good one.
It was a really interesting one.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Bye.